I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. For those of you who just got your food, please continue to eat. I just want to make sure there's enough time for Professor Agawa to speak and for us to have questions and answers afterwards, but feel free to keep eating, and there are cookies and coffee, etc., so help yourself. My name is David Fleschler. I am the Vice Provost for International Affairs here at Case Western Reserve University. And on behalf of both the university and the Center for International Affairs, I'd like to welcome you and extend our gratitude to our partner in this event, which is the Consul General of Japan in Detroit. The Consul General really helped make this possible. So thank you to the Consul General, but also to all of you for being here. We're particularly honored to welcome the Deputy Consul General, Yuki Sakai, here today. She is a career diplomat with Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and assumed her post in Detroit last May. So Deputy Consul Sakai, maybe you could stand up and be recognized. I'd also like to mention, although he's not here, Dr. Hiroshiki Fujita, who is a graduate of Case Western Reserve University and the president and CEO of Quality Electrodynamics here in Cleveland. Some of you may know Hiro's story. He graduated, worked for several other companies for a little while. He then started his company literally with himself in Mayfield Village. Today there are over 200 people employed there, many engineers actually from Case Western Reserve at the company. They just celebrated their 10th anniversary. It's really a terrific success story and a real success story of people who come from outside of the country to the United States and make a real difference and employ people and really add to our lives. So it was Hiro who called me. He's on the International Affairs Visiting Committee. He called me originally and said that Professor Agawa was coming. Would we like to host him because he has a relationship with the consul in Detroit. So he's not here, but we can thank him in absentia. I'd finally like to thank those from the Center for International Affairs who helped put this together. An event like this is not easy to put on, and I'd particularly like to thank Caitlin Leonti, who really was was behind making all of this. So, Caitlin, maybe you can stand up and we can thank you. And Professor Agawa, before I introduce you, maybe we can have the audience, not individually, but the audience sort of introduce themselves to you so you know who's here. I'd just like to ask people from the different schools to sort of raise their hands if you're here and represented, and Professor Agawa can see sort of who's in the room. So maybe the people from the law school can just raise their hands so we can see who's here. Well, we've got Tim Webster here from the law school, the engineering school. We've got a number of people from the engineering school, the College of Arts and Sciences. Many from the College of Arts and Sciences. That's wonderful. I know I'm going to miss one or two of the schools, but the Weatherhead School of Management. I know our dean is here, and a number of colleagues from the Weatherhead School. The School of Nursing. I don't know if anybody's here from the School of Nursing. The College of, we already said College of Arts and Sciences. The Mandel School that's our social work school. Professor Agawa. And what am I missing? I'm sorry? Medicine, yes, right? Anybody here from the medical school? There we go, yes. And the College of Dental Medicine? Nobody here from our dental medicine school. Okay. So who have I missed? I'm sorry? We can ask for the students of Japanese language to raise their hand. So many here. So we hope you won't speak in Japanese because the rest of us may have a difficult time with that. And then I know that there are people from both the community and our administrative staff from the university. So thank you all for being here, and that's a little bit for Professor Agawa is who we have here. So I'd now like to introduce Professor Naoyuki Agawa. He is currently the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. He has previously taught at a number of universities, including Keio University, the University of Virginia, Georgetown University Law Center, and Tokyo University. From 2002 to 2005, Professor Agawa served as Minister for Public Affairs in charge of public diplomacy and press relations at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. He's also practiced law with firms in both Washington and Tokyo. So, Tim, this is really for you. For those who are familiar with major international law firms, he has been with Nishimura and Partners in Tokyo and Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher in Washington, both major international firms. He's written numerous books and papers, most centered around, interestingly enough, U.S. constitutional law and law of the seas, in addition to the relationship between the U.S. And Japan. Prior to working at Doshisha, Mr. Agawa taught at multiple institutions, including Keio University, Georgetown University Law Center, and University of Virginia. He's contributed to numerous journals and newspapers, and he's a frequent speaker. And we were just talking about his tour in the United States now, where he's going from, I think, Texas to Ohio to Connecticut and Michigan. So he's quite a well-known speaker in the United States. Now, I have a little personal story to tell, which is my daughter, who is a senior at the University of Southern California, went on a trip sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Japan about 3 weeks ago. And I looked at her itinerary, and Professor Agawa was on the itinerary. So I said, you must go up to him and tell him that you're the daughter of the person who has invited him to come to Case Western Reserve. He didn't know who I was, of course, but at any rate, so we now have a family connection with you, Professor Agawa. So we are very excited to have you here today, as you can see by the people in the room, to hear your presentation titled Japan-U.S. Relations in the Changing World, North Korea, China, and America First. So with that, Professor Agawa, we look forward to your talk.
I think good afternoon. It's great to be here. And thank you very much for your wonderful and too kind introduction. It sounds like that I have done so many things deeply. I just touched on that, all these things, and it sounds like that I have been here and there. I am very happy that I'm at University, Case Western Reserve. I'm also very happy to be in Ohio. Although I've been to Cleveland once before, but just a day business trip, and this is really the first time that I have gotten a chance to speak to true Ohioans and those who are studying here. I was thinking about me and Ohio, and it just dawned on me that there was a connection between me and Ohio from the very early time. That is that when I was young as some of the students here, there was a time when I was young or younger, and I got this scholarship to study at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and I was excited but very nervous about coming to the United States of America, literally for the first time, except for exchange summer program in Hawaii, which I joined when I was a high school student. That sort of prompted me to want to come to study in the United States mainland. I didn't know anything about the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, and the heartland of America. Around that time, I met a student from Harvard. She was studying Japanese and Japanese management, I think. And we went out a couple times, and she happened to be from Washington, D.C. And I told her that I was coming to the United States to study. And she said, "Oh, great. I will have my father pick you up at the airport." All right? And thank you. And lo and behold, when I got to Dulles International Airport in Washington, greater Washington, D.C. area, this big guy came with a bold paper saying, "Welcome to the United States, Agawa," kind of thing. And that was eventually became a very close friend of mine. And he was a scientist, actually once the director of the space shuttle program, and he was from Youngstown, Ohio. And he was from a very poor Jewish family and wanted to earn some money before the war. He worked at the Youngstown Tube and Pipe Company, steel tube and pipe company, and so eager to earn money, he did 3 shifts a day, and he collapsed. And later went to Yale with a GI Bill after the war. And in fact, it just dawned on me later, much later, that he was picking up a Japanese who must have looked like the soldiers he fought against on the island of Iwo Jima. And I thought a lot about it, but that's how far we came. Since then, we were once enemies. But as Ambassador Howard Baker said when he was ambassador to Japan, that it's next to miracle that we became such close friends after that bitter and terrible war. Well, with that note, thank you very much for giving me a chance to speak to you about what's happening in our part of the world and what's happening in Japan. And I wanted to prepare for this speech and other speeches I have given and I'm going to give in a coherent way. And I haven't had really time to prepare my complete, perfect speech. So forgive me if my speech doesn't meet your expectation, but in that case, you can get coffee and some very good cookies and just entertain yourself. But I will try to do my best and to be as entertaining and as informative as possible. When I thought about how to talk about this subject matter and what to talk about, I thought that I wanted to talk about that subject matter in the context of this changing world. Recently, I think we have all seen so many changes all over the world, not only in Northeast Asia, but also in the United States. That's why I put North Korea, China, and America first, because in our part of the world, North Korea and China are big issues, and there are some dynamic changes and scary changes over there. But at the same time, just a year ago, Mr. Trump was inaugurated as the President of the United States, and he kept saying, America first, right? And one of the reasons I was very curious when Foreign Service friends of mine kindly asked if I would be able to do this speech tour was because Ohio is a crucial state, and I understand that there are lots of Trump supporters and non-supporters simultaneously in this state, as collectively your state went to Mr. Trump. And I'm very curious. I'd rather hear you tell me what you think about Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump is, perhaps in my view, not the cause of all these changes, but a symptom of the changes that are happening in the world. If you think about it, for the 70 years since the end of the Second World War, America has had a very consistent foreign policy agenda. That is to make the world more open, more equal, freedom of speech, freedom of information, rule of law, democracy. Put it simply, is what John Eikenberry of Princeton says, the liberal international order. when Mr. Reagan went to Berlin, he famously said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, tear down that wall. Now, the first thing that we heard from Mr. Trump when he ran for the campaign was, I'm going to build a wall, right? So he's a wall president. And it's interesting that he's still trying to build that wall. But he's not the only person who is interested in building walls. You have all sorts of opinions about this thing, and I certainly respect each party's views on building walls and not building walls, and all sorts of issues related therein. But for instance, the Brits decided to get out of EU, and it's called Brexit, as everybody knows. It's in a sense sort of a building an invisible wall between the continent and the island, and that's a major departure from the previous policy of the United Kingdom. They have been working so hard to be part of Europe. Now they're going back to the traditional position of, being away from the continent. That's a sort of a version of wall. You go to Jerusalem and you see tall walls separating Jews from Palestinians. And when I was there a few years ago, I was just appalled how tall and how big and how complete these walls are. The Chinese have a very unique wall. Well, the Chinese, first of all, is the world's most veteran of building walls. I mean, that's the Chinese wall, which goes back to the 6th or 7th century, maybe later. But now they have a sort of a unique system in which, in terms of market economy, they allow freedom of goods and freedom of trade and freedom of commerce, financial transaction, more or less. But when it comes to the matter of inflow of democratic ideas and freedom of information, freedom of press kind of thing, they have a wall there. So they are walling out the certain kinds of ideas, the sort of liberal international, all that kind of things. And at the same time, they are walling in certain territorial waters by building man-made islands in the South China Sea and also in East China Sea. It's not an easy wall to understand, but it's a complex wall system, and they have all sorts of reasons for doing that. I certainly respect that, but that tends to cause some tension with neighboring countries, as you know. So I decided that I will call this phenomenon as the age of walls. This is an age of walls that we are living in. And there are such changes everywhere, but we happen to be living in Northeast Asia or East Asia. So we have, we in Japan too, have to think about some of the changes that are happening around us, such as North Korea being increasingly more scary, and that's a clear and present danger. And the fact that North Korea claims that they can launch ICBM to the United States is a major change in terms of United States security as well as Japan's security situation. Korea also, South Korea has a new president, and we are having some interesting, to say the least, relationship with South Korea. If I have time, I might talk about some of the things between Korean Peninsula as a whole and South Korea and Japan relationship in connection with this changing dynamic East Asian situation. China, I have a lot to talk about. But Japan internally too has some major changes going on. Now, how many of you have been to Japan here? Oh, so many. I'm very happy. thank you for coming to buy some Japanese things and drop some dollars over there. In fact, we have so many international visitors in Japan today. I'm now working and living almost, part-time in Kyoto. But every day in Kyoto, you have so many tourists from abroad. You have Chinese tourists, many of them, Korean tourists, Thai, Vietnamese, American, French, English, and just chatting with them is very interesting. They're so interested in American, Japanese history and tradition, and Kyoto is a wonderful. If you haven't been there, please do let me know. But seemingly, I think my impression is that those who have been to Japan tend to have a rather favorable views and impressions about Japan. And I said, come on, we have lots of bad things going on in Japan. There are some crooks and there are, thugs and then there are, very careless people, so forth, so on. How many of you, of those people who have been to Japan, felt that Japan was a terrible country? Be honest, I'm not going to be offended. What do you dislike most about Japan? I would love to hear that because I have my personal opinion about some of the, pros and cons about Japan. But my impression is that many of my friends who came from the United States to Japan felt that Japan was very clean, very safe, and people are kind, so forth and so on. And I feel very good about it, but at the same time, I have to reflect on how we can improve that. So in a way, Japan is a relatively happy country where, a welfare system is in place and people are, generally speaking, they're always complaining, but generally speaking, relatively affluent, sort of advanced country. But in fact, we have some serious issues facing us today. If you dig in a little more into the sort of core of the thing, what are the changes that are going on right now? As I said, Japan's welfare system is probably one of better ones in the world, and you have national medical care, and you go to any doctor and you only pay about 30% of the medical cost. The rest is taken care by the government. And when you get older, you get pension, mandatory pension, and you keep paying for the savings, Social Security tax, and then you get the accumulated amount, share of that when you get older. You have the same thing, but that doesn't work perfectly, but that's the system that we have, luckily. And I think that we're very proud of the fact that we are one of the longest living peoples in the world. I'm getting old, but my aunt is 109 years old, and she's still going on. She doesn't speak as much, but she expresses her feeling, by, oh, no, I'm not going to eat this kind of thing. And my mother is 90 years old, and they are taken fairly good care of. But the problem is that, in a way, I hate to say this, but we are quickly aging because nobody dies, And so, well, that's an exaggeration, but the average age, the expected lifespan for Japanese women is something close to 90, right? And they go on, and women are much stronger than men, may I say. I think that's universal, but they are very active, walking around, dancing aerobics and that kind of things, But somebody has to support them, and what the numbers that I have seen is that by 2050, half of Japan's population will be over 65, roughly. And that means that 1 out of every 2 person, one has to support 2 of them, right? that's going to be a major burden on Japan's financial system. Already, we have a huge national debt in order to pay for this welfare system, plus defense, and plus this and that. We have bigger than 2 times of the national debt level is bigger than twice the size of the GNP. And that's a heavy burden. The reason why we have such an aging society, and the result of that is that our population is shrinking because the elder citizens don't die young, and they're a much lower birth rate than average. So that results in shrinking population, and that's the problem. Fewer people to support increasing number of senior citizens. And in fact, by 2050, Japan's population will decline to about 3/4 of the current population. 1/4 of the population will be gone by 2050. And the share of world GNP that Japan has now is about 12% of the total GNP of the world. By 2050, it's going to be 4%. So to put it bluntly, Japan is declining power, right? But the question is, if we accept the fact that we are increasingly becoming a declining power, how are we going to survive, and how are we going to maintain our sort of conditions, and how are we going to decline in a graceful and constructive way? I think there's only one way to do that. That is not to try to do everything by ourselves, but work with others, other countries, other peoples. And so this is where I want to talk more about security policy of Japan, because that applies to Japan's security policy as well. Given the budgetary limitation, given the fact that the population is shrinking, that's going to have a major impact upon our security policy. Because even if we can afford expensive weapon system and other equipment, if the number of younger people is shrinking, we may not be able to man our armed forces. And that's already happening. We have some terrific Japanese so-called Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force and Air Self-Defense Force. We are short of people there, and that's going to be increasingly so. As I said, we are living in a very dangerous neighborhood, most notably the North Korean situation. We need a system to defend ourselves, and we are buying a new land-based Aegis system. We are introducing a bunch of F-35s from the United States. We are introducing new THAAD system, which is a new version of missile defense system, so forth and so on. But first thing first, we have to man our armed forces. What do we do? I think the answer is obvious. 2 things. One, we will work very closely, and we will continue to improve our capability to work with the United States through the U.S.-Japan alliance. So the United States-Japan alliance is vital to this picture. Also, what we are trying to do is not only do we want to work closely and continue to work closely with the United States in terms of security situation and peace and security in East Asia and of Japan, we are now working ever more closely with some other countries, like-minded countries, such as Australia, India, interestingly. Japan and India are increasingly closely working together. We are also working closely with Singapore. We are working with New Zealand, Canada, France, and UK. Formally, we tended to look at our security needs only as a bilateral things, the United States and Japan. But we are trying to sort of keep that, at the same time, sort of increase the network of security policy coordination all over the area. And that's what the Prime Minister has been recently talking about as Indo-Pacific strategy, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Let me just show you in a sort of tangible way what I'm talking about. I just wanted to show you a picture of 2015 naval review. That is a bunch of Japanese naval vessels get together and show to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister will review all the fleets and men of the seas, but also to show what kind of capabilities we have to our friends and neighbors in terms of maritime forces. And to be honest with you, I'm a sort of a Navy freak, so I was very happy that I was there. Now, it was not only the U.S. Maritime Self-Defense Force who was showing their fleets and that kind of things, but also some other countries joined this fleet. Most notably, here is USS Ronald Reagan, which is home-ported in Yokosuka, Japan. And the ship is so big that she didn't join the naval fleet review, but it just so happened that she was in the neighborhood. I think it was intentional, but she passed by all the ships there. I don't have pictures for that, but other navies, including Indian Navy, French Navy, and South Korean Navy as well, and French and who else? Australian Navy all came to join us to show to the world that we are working together, not in an aggressive mode, but just to show that we are communicating, we're working together, we have these joint forces, and we continue to work on that. Now, let me say that we are not showing our might in reaction to some of the things that China is doing, but clearly we are sending the signal to the Chinese that we're closely watching what you're doing, and we are working together. Let me show you one map, and this is a map which shows the world from, in a way, Chinese perspective. And as you can see, that China is in the center of the world. Well, the Chinese have always thought that they're in the center of the world, and I agree that they are a wonderful country, great country, with a great population, great number of people working very hard, and they call themselves the center flower, Zhenghua. Is that correct? Changhua, Chuka? I don't know. It's the way I understand is that's the flower in the center, and China is in the center. And there's one mistake about this map, and Mongolia is counted as Chinese territory. No offense meant to anybody from Mongolia, but this is not what I made. But looking at the world in a very different way, this is an upside-down map of the world. I don't know how many of you have seen this map. I bumped into this map at a conference where a New Zealander colleague of mine showed this thing. New Zealanders are always frustrated at international conference because when anybody shows a world map, either New Zealand is not there, or that New Zealand is at the very periphery of the map. This map shows, this is a sort of exaggerated but accurate map, shows that New Zealand is on top of the world, right? And in the center of the world. And that's the point that they wanted to make. New Zealand is the center of the world, and Australia too. But when I look at this map, I felt a couple of things. One is that, interestingly, we tend to talk about great oceans of the world as the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. But this shows that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean are one and together and the same. It's a big one ocean, right? And yes, there are Southeast Asia, which consists of some landmass and lots of islands. But you can go through them back and forth very freely. And recently, the U.S. defense leaders and Japanese government are increasingly talking about the sort of a togetherness of this whole two oceans together. And as that's the concept of Indo Pacific strategy. This is the most thriving and most promising area that we need to work together. So Harry Harris, the commander of the Pacific Command, United States Armed Forces, famously said, the 7th Fleet of the United States is active from Bollywood to Hollywood. That's what he means from India and beyond to Africa. And it's in our common interest, China included and everybody included, to keep these vast waters as free as possible for commerce, trade, people's movement, migration, so forth and so on. Now, from the security point of view also, if you take a smaller map, look at smaller map, it just dawned on me that with India and Australia and Japan, we're sort of blocking China. We're not preventing anything from China from doing anything out of China, but we're sort of surrounding China. And I can see why Chinese friends of ours are pretty interested in South China Sea. That's the way out for them to get out into the ocean, right? I'm not criticizing or I'm praising, I'm just saying that this is a fact. And another thing that I noticed was that in order for the United States to remain interested in this part of the world, Japan is the closest to the United States. Herein lays the reason why U.S.-Japan close security tie is very important, vital. Now, so along this line, the United States and Japan and other countries in this area are working together to improve our total collective security capability, because none of us can do it alone. And we are increasing our defense budget, and we are improving our communication with our allies and friends, and we are exercising together. And also, let me emphasize that often, very often, they work together for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief kind of things. We are very thankful to the United States as well as other countries for coming to help the Japanese when we had the great earthquake in 2011, and U.S. Marine Corps and the American Navy came immediately to help us, and we are all forever thankful for that. Canada, New Zealand, everybody came, Taiwan in particular. Now, there are some issues here. There are some issues. Number one issue is, are we Japanese going to continue to be able to do this, and then do we want to do this, much greater cooperation, security cooperation? I'm running out of time, so let me just be brief. There's this shrinking population issue. Can we man it? Can we afford it? At the same time, there's this very strong pacifist sentiment existing in Japan. And Prime Minister Abe is proposing, in order for us to play a bigger role in this region's security issue as a whole, we have to change some laws. We have to allow defense forces to be able to do things that were formerly considered to be not doable. And he's even proposing to amend the Constitution of Japan, which literally prohibits Japan from fighting a war and having Navy, Air Force, and Army. Do we want to do something about it? And because of the horrible experience and regrets that we have about our having been an aggressive country, a chunk of Japanese population still very hesitant to more closely work in the military field with the United States, with other countries. So that's a big if. Another issue is, as we talk about Indo-Pacific strategy, free and open, rule of law, rule-oriented, freedom of navigation kind of things, our Chinese friends are now actively, and in a very positive way, I think, their idea about how this region should be, dealt with, the one band, one route, road idea, and Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, financial corporation. Japan is willing to join this, and lots of European countries are in it. But how do we sort of coordinate these things? So I will stop here, but I will welcome any question that you have about this. This is a big picture, but there are some specific and difficult issues, and most notably, what are we going to do about North Korea as we speak? And so I'll stop here, and thank you for listening. Yeah, sure. Anybody? Yes, over there.
So has anyone in Japan ever talked about modifying its immigration policies so that you could increase the population with many of the displaced people around the world?
I think talking about this age of wars things, sometimes I think about the fact Japan has been the most notorious war country because it's closed, notoriously closed for market opening. It has resisted the idea of having new immigrants coming in from abroad. Interestingly, I think that we are now about to change some of those things. Now, but we have to be realistic as to how much we can do for the next few years or for the next 5 years. When some other countries, which have been very keen on keeping the liberal international order, and you may recall that about 5 years ago or 4 years ago, many of the international press and scholars have been criticizing Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, as being a reactionary, trying to reinstitute the old, wartime constitution, going back to the era when Japan was more aggressive kind of things. Mr. Abe, in a way, surprisingly but constructively, has been very open-door policy person. In fact, he's probably the supporter, the vanguard of international liberal order among G7 countries today. He supports Paris Accord, he supports TPP, he supports women in workforce and encourages that. He talks to the business leaders to raise the workers' pay, and he supports this, joint security policy sort of things. And so I think his tone is more open Japan, more innovative Japan, so forth, so on. When it comes to immigration, interestingly, I think Prime Minister Abe, last year indicated that we need to increase the number of those foreigners who become naturalized citizens of Japan, provided they are willing to learn something about Japan, the language, and be a good citizens of Japan. But let's face it, the population of Japan is about 1.2 billion, 120 million or so, and about 99% of that population is Japanese ethnically, and only 0.5 or so is Korean and Chinese. And although when you go to Tokyo or anywhere else in Japan these days, you have Vietnamese and Thais and Pakistanis and others working, but they are mostly temporary sort of residents of Japan. speaking very good Japanese. I'm impressed. And they are not in the main circles of Japanese society. And what are we going to do? Because already the globalization of population has begun to happen, but the number of refugee status given by the Japanese government to anybody who ask for refugee status in Japan is pathetically low, as you know. It's something like 20 a year, not 20,000, but 20 a year. How are we going to implement a policy to increase the number of foreign working, willing, and smart foreign professionals to come to Japan and to be part of the society in a very smooth and equal way? That's a major task. I personally advocate the idea that we will bring in substantial number of foreigners, and we are encouraging foreign students to come and study, but it's going to take time, and there are going to be some issues about that. Already there are some claims that Japanese, like some Brazilians with Japanese ancestry, come to Japan and are not treated very well, not enough Japanese language education or in Spanish, and so forth. So we have a lot to deal with. But now is the time, I think, Japan to think about how to implement more US-like accommodation policy. It may take 20 years, but it's never too late to begin to think about it. I support your idea. Thank you. Yes, please, Madam.
How's the relationship between Japan and Russia now?
Oh.
It's changing all around that region.
Yeah, first of all, the reason I didn't include Russia in my discussion is because I don't know very much about Russia. Interestingly, Prime Minister Abe has gotten along with Mr. Putin very well. It's sort of I'm not comfortable thinking about the fact that Mr. Abe has a tendency to get along with strong leaders of the world, to say the least. Erdogan, Modi, Putin, Mr. Trump and Mr. Abe seem to be getting along with each other relatively well. And in fact, during the campaign, Mr. Trump suggested that since Japan is not paying enough share of the defense cost of this area, that he might withdraw all the armed forces, U.S. armed forces from Japan when he becomes the president. I think some wise advisors said to Mr. President when he became president, no, that's not a very good idea. Mr. Putin and Mr. Abe are talking, and they are talking quite often. And I think Mr. Abe frankly says to Mr. Putin that you should do something about North Korean situation. Mr. Putin seems to listen to him. But we have to be very cautious about Russia. I don't think that Mr. Putin is very reliable. And there are some reasons why Mr. Putin seems to be very friendly to Mr. Abe. Russia is suffering from shortage of population as well in the eastern part of that country, Siberia. In fact, I think the Russians are very worried about the possibility that the Siberia will be eventually taken over by the Chinese. Very peacefully, I mean, they're slowly coming from the south and take over the whole thing. So Japan is a way to sort of have a hedging sort of policy vis-a-vis China as well as the United States. Don't talk to the United States too much. We should work together. Japan has an interest also to persuade Mr. Putin to return the northern territory to Japan. And that's a sort of a negotiation point. And they're having some talks, but I don't think that Mr. Putin in the near future will return these islands because he has to think about the Western front as well. Japan also has a motivation to talk to Russia because, again, it's part of this sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. If you have one more country to sort of not to block China in any way, but to have a counterbalance to the north. And also, there's this very important issue of the northern passage. The ice in the Arctic Ocean is melting. So Europe and Japan and China, distance-wise, is very great, but in terms of navigable water, it's going to happen, and it's already happening. So there are all sorts of reasons why Japan and Russia are trying to work together, but I don't think that will be a major factor in this thing. But Russia continues to be a nuclear arsenal country. Russia continues to be a major power, so we need to keep talking to them. Anybody else? Yes, madam.
How are women doing in the workforce in Japan? And I know there are advances, but are there places that could improve faster?
First of all, you're talking to the wrong guy. Aged Japanese male, right? So I may be a wrong person to talk to. You should talk to my daughter-in-law, who is a practicing lawyer and has 2 kids to take care of. I will try to answer your question as much as possible. I think the situation has improved drastically over the past 30 years, 40 years, during my sort of working experiences, my career. When I joined a company called small mom and pop electronics shop in Tokyo called Sony, have you heard about it? I mean, the difference between how the company deals with men and women are drastically different. For instance, when I joined this section of Sony, it was customary. It was not written anywhere, but women come into the office 10, 15 minutes before the company, the working hours start, and their requirement was to come and make tea for men. And I'm very proud of the fact that I said, cut it out, just let's stop it. And I was for a little while very popular among women workers at Sony. I think that today, Japanese women out of college or high school have much more chances to do as much as male workers. They're given opportunities. They often go abroad to be stationed in New York, London, elsewhere. They get equal pay. According to my daughter-in-law, however, the biggest challenge for working women is the fact that Japan doesn't have enough number and sufficient number of child care facilities, right? In order for any professional woman to work, because God created us differently, and it has to be women who bear child, temporarily they cannot work, regardless whether that's 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. First of all, the Japanese government in particular have installed some period of time when they can take off and raise kids, maternity leave, but paternity leave as well. I know some men who took that leave while their wives continue to try to get back to work, and that kind of thing has to be sufficient and adequate. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Japan. So one of the things that we need to do is just to have a social system, either private or public, to support and take care of the babies and young kids while their mothers are working. Also, I think unfortunately, the mentality and natural tendency for the elder members of the society is that we welcome women workers, but there are women, we take very good care of them, kind of things, and they tend to treat women workers differently. Unlike the United States, some older men are not used to having equal partners and equal co-workers. They tend to be either they tend to be bossy or they tend to be too sweet to them, right? You know, they can't shout to each other, and they can't argue on a professional basis. So those are the invisible barriers. But I am very, very optimistic because when I see my students at colleges, women usually have higher grades than men. Is that the case here? I don't know. and a major difference between my time and your time is that women tend to be leaders than men. And that is a fact. And I think that today's generation, young generation, I'm sure will find it very easy to have coworkers who happen to be bossy women, right? And that's fine. I think that the things should be that way, and Japan is trying to catch up. We are increasing the number of military people who are women, who are pilots and captains and that kind of thing. Compared to Europe, compared to the United States, it's still slow, too small perhaps for you, but they are working on it. Mr. Abe is primarily the leader in this movement. Yes, please.
I'm curious your opinion about higher education and Japanese students studying abroad. It seems that there are fewer today than in the past. Is this due to demographic shifts or something else? And what do you see as the trend?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question is, do Japanese students decide not to come to study in the United States? I mean, just to paraphrase your question, and is that, if that's the case, why? And what are you trying to do to prevent that from happening? I have received this question so many times because I was at my previous school where I was a vice president. I was vice president in charge of international affairs and collaboration. I often attended international conference on the globalization of education kind of thing. And the question is, why Japanese students, fewer Japanese students are coming to study in the United States? And seems to be very visible compared to very eager and active and dynamic Korean students and Chinese students. I have been struggling with that question myself, and I have some hypotheses, but I don't have a definite answer to that question. Let me just list some of the things, in now particular order. One is that Japanese youngsters are complacent about where they are right now. Japan is not the best place in the world to work or be a leader, but nevertheless, as I said, it's a safe place. They can get a job because the demand for young talents is increasing, and why do I want to go to the United States or Europe to get a degree if you can go to Japanese universities and can get a very good job? If we stay in Japan, it's safe, and we have good ramen and sushi. Why do you want to go to the United States to have hamburgers and that kind of thing? I'm not saying that, by the way. I love burgers. There is that tendency. In a way, younger Japanese are becoming a little more traditional and sort of introvert than my generation. My generation, Japanese were dying to come to the United States. Indeed, I did, because I just dreamed about being in the United States. My father and mother came to the United States for the first time in the 50s and told me, now, you touch the button and you get the pineapple juice and that kind of thing. Air conditioning, the garage door goes automatically kind of thing. Wow, dream. But that's mundane in Japan today. So there's no newness. Another reason why, comparatively speaking to studying in China or Australia, the United States colleges are so expensive, ridiculously expensive. So cost-benefit analysis tells you, I do need to get some international sort of experiences, but the United States is so expensive, I don't think I want to go there for 4 years or 2 years to get a degree. I would just go to Australia, you know, cheaper, easier, closer home, or New Zealand. They may have a little different accent, but you know, nothing's wrong about New Zealand accent. I'll be able to speak English kind of thing. Australia, UK, New Zealand, and Canada are very, very actively trying to persuade the Japanese students to come study because they need foreign students to survive. Compared to that, some of the people that I talk to in the United States, particularly the East Coast elite schools, tend to say, we would welcome Japanese students provided that they can pay and they can pass the entrance examination, right? That's not easy. And so that's two reasons. Another is that they tend to think about only Yale, Princeton kind of things, and just quickly give up the idea of coming to other schools. And they are not aware of the fact that there are excellent schools, wonderful schools all over the United States, schools like yours, schools on the West Coast, and they don't know very much about what kind of opportunities there. But nevertheless, let me say this. If there's any way of studying abroad, many of my students' first priority is the United States. I think there is something about the United States that attracts Japanese students, those who are always there, who are eager to study abroad and willing to be more globally oriented. And they know that the United States is the best place. And I think that the government and private universities such as ours are trying to promote that. And lastly, this relates to the first question, the first point about complacency. This phenomenon of not coming in a greater number to study abroad is in a way the result of success story. Japan, among many countries, is the almost only country where we have established our education system so consistent, so well that you can do nuclear engineering, DNA science, life science, or medical school, all in Japanese, right? And so if it's cheaper and of good quality, they tend to. But the smartest Japanese students are now sort of, you know, restless, and they say, is the Japanese education that good? I'd rather go abroad. So things are changing. Some things are hard to change. And I'm optimistic that some of the Japanese students will continue to aspire to come to study, not only here, but elsewhere as well. Yes, please.
Professor Agawa, I have two interrelated questions.
Do you want to use that microphone?
Am I talking too low?
I hope that you can hear him, right?
I try to be a little louder. Yeah, you said that a large number of Japanese now are against changing the Japanese constitution because Japan was once a very aggressive expansionist country. And in relation to this, I have two related questions. First is about your father. I heard that your father was a writer, and one of his works, including Reluctant Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind of Japan's Pearl Harbor attack. And he also joined the Japanese Navy. So I'm curious, what was his idea, understanding of Japan's so-called aggressiveness in Pearl Harbor attack? Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? That's my first question. The second is there are many first-class professionals in international politics, law, military affairs, etc., including the former president, American President Hoover, Herbert Hoover, and even Douglas MacArthur for Japan say that Japan's war attack of the Pearl Harbor was primarily an act of self-defense. So my two questions. First, about your father's view about the war between Japan and the United States. And my second question is your own personal view about this issue.
Well, thank you very much for your two questions, and I have a feeling that in order to answer your two questions, it will take another an hour and a half to just begin to think about it. My father was a writer, and my father was a novelist, and joined the Imperial Japanese Navy, and had a wonderful time there because he didn't have to fight any battle, and he was mainly decoding Chinese telegram, and it was so easy that he had a wonderful food in the Tokyo Navy headquarters and that kind of thing. So he remained to be fond of the way in which the Navy officers do certain things. And after the war, he wrote this biography of Yamamoto, Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack. Interestingly, and I think this is what you're asking about, Yamamoto was a Navy officer who had spent some time in the United States and came to a conclusion that we cannot have a war against this country, and we will lose. And it was ironical that he was in a position to attack the first initial attack on Pearl Harbor, and he chose Pearl Harbor, and that may have been a mistake, but he did. Because of that, his hometown was heavily bombed by B-29s. The point that my father was trying to make is that I think I agree, and he agreed, that that war was not a justifiable war for Japan to fight. But at the same time, I don't know if there's any southerner here, but although the cause of the Southern Confederate States was wrong, clearly, in retrospect, there were some people who fought for the country at that time, their states. And I generally, and this may be politically totally incorrect, pardon me if I say that, but Robert E. Lee and some others fought for Virginia and that kind of things, and for the wrong cause, but with the spirit of having to defend their families and that kind of thing. Some Japanese felt that way. Interestingly, my father joined the Navy because he hated the Japanese army so much that he didn't want to join the totalitarian kind of army, and his early ambition was to get rid of the army, and he just hated the Japanese army, joined the Navy. Having said that, the Japanese did not, some of the Japanese at least, they didn't mean to expand Japanese territory in order to fight the war. I don't think justifies what Japan did. I think that it's not 100% allies were right and 0% that Japan was wrong, but it's 20 to 80%. I think that we tried to justify the war, but we couldn't because we were really aggressors in Asia. We attacked China without reason. We had a puppet regime in Manchuria that the international community all condemned, and Japan walked out of the League of Nations, United Nations, League of Nations. We colonized Korea, saying that if we hadn't taken it, the Russians would have taken it. That doesn't justify what Japan did. That was Japan which did it, and we regret that very much. But having said that, and you have all sorts of opinions about whether something that Japan did during and before the war was right or wrong, I think these memories, as I said, my Jewish father was a person who fought the Iwo Jima battle on the Allied side. And in my personal experience, my father had a fiancée in Hiroshima, and she was killed by the atomic bomb. I have a very mixed feeling about this thing, because had she survived and had my father married her, I would not have been talking to you today, right? Because he married somebody else, i.e. my mother. Life is full of mysteries. And what we have to do is just to keep remembering what a terrible experience we all had. And some people did some terrible things, but should not be the reason why we cannot work together. And we should be close to each other. And I always tell my Korean students, do remember what Japan did to you. That's perfectly fine. But that should not be the reason why we should not work, and we should work together. That's my feeling. Thank you very much.
So this has been a wonderful hour and a half, Professor. Thank you very much for all the insight that you've given us to and Japan and the region. We look forward to you coming back potentially and addressing us again. I think we've gained a lot from it, and we very much appreciate it. So thank you all for being here.